Ancient cultures viewed nature as a continual struggle between the forces of order and chaos. For 2 centuries, scientists lay stress upon the order. Now chaos is making a comeback. If ever there's a subject to bolster postmodern anxieties, to create an impression that everything is coming unstuck, it has to be chaos theory. Yet, paradoxically, it seems that even chaos has a hidden mathematical order. Paul, science is founded, of course, on the notion of predictability. Yet nature can be capricious, recalcitrant. Enter the highly fashionable chaos theory. But it wasn't so long ago that things looked much more secure. Let's look briefly, if we can, at Newton's vision of the universe.
Newton had this famous image of the so-called clockwork universe. There's a well-known expression as regular as clockwork, and this conveys the impression that Newton's laws give us some sort of mathematical dependability. I suppose the most obvious expression of that is the orderly way in which the planets are supposed to move around the sun. But in principle, it can be applied to every atom and every body in the universe, so that according to Newton's laws, there is a deterministic set of equations, which means that everything is going to go according to plan.
We've previously introduced Schrödinger's cat. It might be time to discuss another creature, Laplace's demon.
This clockwork universe image of Newton reached its pinnacle with Pierre Laplace over 100 years later. And Laplace saw that if Newton's laws should apply literally to every atom in the universe, then in a sense the future of the universe would be fixed in advance. He imagined some sort of cosmic intelligence, often known as Laplace's demon, which would be powerful enough not only to know where every atom was located and how it was moving, but could subject it to analysis, I think was his expression. In other words, could work out the equations and figure out in advance where every atom was going to be, say, in 1,000,000 years. Now, according to Newton's clockwork universe, the underlying principles there, it is possible, knowing the state of the universe exactly at one moment, to compute in detail its state at all subsequent moments, and incidentally at all previous moments. So what this would mean, if it were true, is that everything that happens in the universe, including to human beings, right down to the wiggling of the tiniest finger, would already be fixed in advance.
Reassuring but rather dull.
Well, rather dull. In fact, Ilya Prigogine, the Belgian chemist, I think sums it up rather well. He says it's rather like God being an archivist turning the pages of a cosmic history book that's already written.
In an earlier program, you described the unpredictability of quantum mechanics. Is that the only limitation on predictability?
The clockwork universe image might lead us to suppose that if we had enough information about a system, it would be predictable in its every detail.
The stock market, roulette, what have you.
Whatever it happens to be. Of course, we are surrounded by processes and systems that do seem to obey the laws of chance, rather than the laws of physics. Indeed, casino managers make a healthy living depending upon the laws of chance. And the question is, how can we fit these chancy, unpredictable things, like the movement of a roulette ball or the toss of a dice, into this clockwork universe image? Are they compatible, or is there some problem there? Well, people used to suppose that, say, if you roll a die or something like that, if you could know in detail all the little forces that were operating, you could in fact predict how it was going to come down, or toss a coin, you could tell whether it was going to be heads or tails. But what has been discovered this century is in fact that there are circumstances in which a system can be effectively unpredictable, however good our information gathering might be, that we might know almost everything there is to know about the system, yet we still can't predict it. Its behaviour is effectively random.
Enter the fashionable notion of chaos.
That's right. This is often called chaos, or the theory of chaos. It's actually an idea that goes back about a century to the work of Henri Poincaré. It was implicit in his work that there are some physical systems which are so exquisitely sensitive to minute disturbances that effectively they're unpredictable, even though in principle they obey a deterministic set of equations, that is, that they are part of the clockwork universe. In practice, you can never know the level of detail necessary to predict what they're going to do.
There's a toy that belongs to your cat, which has been quite useful in this series. Would you like to produce it again?
Yeah, I'll give you
give us a
my
demonstration.
pocket here. I've got the cat's paw attached to a piece of string. So this makes a pendulum, and we're back to the expression as regular as clockwork. And if I just set it going, it has a certain natural frequency, tick tock, very predictable. Now, supposing we change this a bit by driving it, and what I'm going to do is wiggle my hand backwards and forwards, so we now have a driven pendulum. Now, if I drive the pendulum just above its natural frequency, it settles down into a stable pattern of motion. So it forms a sort of loop, moves in an ellipse, and it would be very easy to predict from one moment to the next what was going to happen. But now if I just change that driving frequency a bit and force set it slightly below its natural frequency, it basically goes haywire. It sometimes goes to the right and sometimes goes to the left. And a careful analysis shows that if you were to observe, say, 4 or 5 swings and try to figure out which way it would be swinging in a minute's time or 2 minutes' time, you couldn't do it. It's effectively random.
Is there a mathematical formula below that, though? Is there a subtext which makes even its randomness in some perverse way predictable?
By definition, you can't predict the randomness, but it's often said that there is order in chaos. We find chaos in many different types of physical systems. This is just one simple example. There are many others, and a lot of them do seem to have a regular mathematical structure underpinning them. So although the actual motion itself may not be predictable, nevertheless the onset of chaos, when chaos will happen, and the way in which chaos is approached, as you may maybe change the driving frequency or change the physical constraints on something, that can have mathematical regularity.
I'm thinking of Leonardo da Vinci trying to draw the flow of water over pebbles, or the visual experience of observing it. Utterly unpredictable, and yet after a while there does seem to be a mathematical order to it.
Well, turbulence is a very good example of order and chaos intermingled. You look at the swirling eddies in a turbulent stream, and that's a classic example of chaos in action. If you try to predict where a little element of fluid is going to be at some later time, that's virtually impossible to do. We have another classic example with the great red spot of Jupiter. It's a coherent structure, but again, if you try to take any given element of fluid and follow it through that great red spot, it becomes unpredictable. So there is a sort of amalgam of order and chaos together in these examples. And so today it's very fashionable to apply chaos theory to turbulence in the hope of understanding it better. People used to suppose that complicated behavior demanded complicated causes. What chaos theory shows is that you can get very complicated behavior from very simple causes. The little pendulum thing that I was showing illustrates this very well.
Paul, I seem to hear the approach of a butterfly.
Yes, there's something called the butterfly effect. I mentioned that a chaotic system behaves randomly because it's so exquisitely sensitized to minute disturbances, we effectively can't predict what is going to happen. All the little twists and turns of fate would have to be followed if we were to know what is going to happen next. This effect was first discovered, as I mentioned, by Poincaré, but it was first made explicit many years later when the first electronic computers were applied to weather forecasting. Now, of course, weather forecasting is notoriously bad. The weather is notoriously unpredictable. And we now realize that there's a very good reason for this. When I was a student, I think everybody supposed if you could just have a big enough computer and gather enough data, we'd be able to have accurate long-range weather forecasts. If the weather is so exquisitely sensitized to the most minute disturbances, then the mere flap of a butterfly's wings here in Adelaide today could affect the course of a hurricane in the United States next week.
But it is a metaphor, not a fact?
Oh, it is a fact. The whole point is of a chaotic system that it really does depend upon these minute disturbances, and that's what makes it unpredictable. It's not a matter of saying, well, all we need to do is study a particular butterfly and we'll be able to forecast the motion of that hurricane. It means that the motion of the hurricane depends upon squillions of these little minute disturbances, and that's what makes it unpredictable.
It seems to me to have infinite applicability to human affairs, to international affairs, for example, because often in history we've seen a couple of major powers trying desperately to avoid war, but some tiny little incident, totally misinterpreted, will trigger devastation.
I think there are many examples where human society is driven to the edge of chaos so that the slightest trigger can cause one course of action or another and totally change the course of human history. I guess you only have to think of Sarajevo and the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. Now, the question is, can we write down a set of equations to somehow, if not predict this effect, at least predict when it's going to happen? I think
a lot of prime ministers would be very grateful if you could.
Well, you see, this is really important because I think we have to accept that if a system becomes chaotic, there's nothing we can do to predict the outcome. But we can predict when chaos is going to occur. We might say, this state of affairs is becoming very dangerous because we're pushing this parameter to the point where we're going to hit the chaotic regime. We can imagine it in economics. We can imagine looking at complicated output of the stock market prices and the gold price and currency fluctuations and so on. And if we're clever enough, saying if we go far enough down this path, if the gold price falls too far, we're going to hit a chaotic regime, and then we won't know what's going to happen next. We can imagine, I often like to say, that the global economy as an example of a self-organizing system. I think a lot of people fondly imagine that politicians and economists set the levers of the economic machine and drive it, that they know what's going on, that it is like a predictable mechanistic system. So if they only get the lever settings right, they will drive it and steer it in a certain predictable direction to a desirable goal. But I think that's a load of nonsense. I think that the world economy, as it's now become globalized, is really a self-organizing system. It's taken on a life of its own. It's got its own dynamic, its own freedom. And all that's happening is that the politicians and the economists are reacting to events when they're setting these levers. They don't
admit to this, and of course they are sorely afflicted by hubris. And this may be one of the virtues of chaos theory, that it makes all of us a little more modest. If there's one profession that learns to live with chaos theory, I think it'd have to be politics. And that makes you wonder whether, out of the prognostications about chaos, some useful tools will emerge.
There's a lot of interest in applying chaos theory to sociology, politics, or economics in particular. Can you make money by applying chaos theory to the stock market? We've got all these little wiggles and jiggles in the record of the stock price or the gold price or whatever. Is there a mathematical formula that shows us what's going on? Now, to a certain extent, it's clear that markets are chaotic systems, or they have periods where they go chaotic, but there are also periods where they appear to be more orderly and predictable.
Well, when the pendulum swing is the common expression to describe them.
Yes. So I think we might have another edge of chaos phenomenon here, and by applying the mathematics of chaos theory to the market, some people claim that they are understanding them better and actually making money from doing this. So this is big business now.
It sometimes seems that scientific theories are like fads. They suddenly explode, there's a great deal of discussion of them, and they ebb away. Is chaos theory, in fact, exhausting itself?
In the early days, I think people saw chaos everywhere. Once they discovered that a chaotic system could be as simple as a driven pendulum, they looked around and they saw chaos in everything in sight. In fact, there was a famous physicist who said that he felt that non-chaotic systems were as scarce as hen's teeth. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. Quite clearly, there are systems which are orderly and predictable, and the solar system mostly falls into that category. But we do see chaos out there, for example, in the asteroid belt. Some asteroids move along orbits which are basically chaotic and eventually get flung out of the solar system altogether. So I think we have to recognize we live in a world which is an exquisite mix of order and chaos. There are those things that are predictable and those things that are unpredictable, and they can be tangled together in a very intimate way. It's not just a matter of saying, well, this whole lot of phenomena over here are going to be orderly and predictable and a clockwork type universe, or all the rest is going to be chaotic. Very often the same type of physical system can go chaotic under only slightly different circumstances from when it's orderly.
Let's be oxymoronic and talk about organised chaos.
The relationship between chaos and organisation, or self-organisation, is rather deep. Let me give you another example of the two at work. We discussed earlier about the great red spot of Jupiter as an organised, coherent structure, but nevertheless the fluid motion through it can be unpredictable and chaotic. Another example of fluid motion, which is a bit of a favourite of mine, is if you take a pan of water, put it on the stove and heat it from beneath. It starts out just totally featureless, but after a while, as the temperature difference between the bottom and the top of the pan builds up, the fluid starts to convect. And if you do this carefully, look on it from above, you see an orderly pattern of hexagonal convection cells. So it spontaneously forms this hexagonal pattern. We call that self-organisation. If you go on heating and the temperature difference becomes greater, it all starts to boil and it becomes chaotic. So the same type of physical system, the same type of mathematics that leads to self-organisation on the one hand also leads to chaos.
You mentioned the edge of chaos. Can we dwell on that edge for a moment?
The example that I gave with the pendulum, I think, illustrates the edge of chaos quite well. If the pendulum is driven at one frequency, it's orderly. If it's driven at another, it's chaotic. And so one, of course, approaches that edge of chaos as you change the driving frequency. And in many examples of chaotic systems, you see how as you approach them, the behavior becomes more and more unpredictable. But there's a virtue in this sin, in that chaos can also have a creative aspect. What is chaos, after all? It's unpredictability, but it is also, in a sense, an openness, a freedom to the future. And on the edge of chaos, one can get the best of both worlds. One has the constraint of the orderly regime and the openness of the chaotic regime. And some people, like Stuart Kauffman, for example, the biophysicist, have suggested that maybe nature's creativity in the biological domain exploits this edge of chaos. Evolution moves us to the edge of chaos, so we're then poised exquisitely between having the openness of being able to explore new pathways, which would not have been predictable, and yet it's not total anarchy.
Is there any evidence that evolution is working to a plan, or are the splendid variety of life forms essentially random?
This is a really fundamental question. When Darwin published his theory of evolution, of course he upset the church. A lot of religious people were deeply offended by the notion that human beings had descended from more primitive life forms, and they worry particularly about being descended from apes. But some sought comfort in Darwin's own theory by putting forward the notion of a ladder of progress, that evolution began with microbes and ended with man, that there was this upward progressive trend, that over the billions of years that evolution has worked its magic, there's been this process of advancement. In other words, it was all directed towards the emergence of something like human beings. And so that gave people some comfort to think that they were the end product of a long, complicated process, but a process nevertheless with a goal, and the goal being humanity. So we could still retain some vestige of that privileged status that we thought we had before Darwin came along and upset the apple cart. Of course, biologists these days hate this sort of terminology. They hate the notion of a ladder of progress. You know, you often see this depiction of a sort of shambling ape gradually coming more upright until we've got, you know, Homo erectus or Homo sapiens, as if this is how it happened, that there was a trend, you know, towards in expectation of...
It's very good for posture training,
the emergence of, that's right, the emergence of human beings. But that there is really no hard evidence at all that there is any directionality in evolution. It is the essence of Darwin's theory that nature has no foresight. It can't look ahead and anticipate what might be needed. Nature is blind, changes occur at random, and the changes which confer some advantage at any particular moment get selected for. But there is no end goal, no directionality to this whole process. At least that is the biologist's position.
So in a word, are we chemical freaks, or are we the consequence of a bio-friendly cosmos?
My own inclination is that we live in a bio-friendly cosmos, that life emerges naturally as part of the outworkings of the basic laws of the universe, and that it will occur often under the right circumstances. But this is pure conjecture.
This question is a leap in the dark, but is there any relevance between chaos theory and artificial intelligence?
I long ago came to the conclusion that our sense of freedom, our sense of free will, is an edge of chaos phenomenon, because free will basically means we can't predict our own behaviour. We feel that there is an openness. We feel we have alternatives. And yet again, it's not total anarchy. I don't sort of suddenly feel, well, I have no idea whether I'm going to leap up out of this chair and dance a jig. I'm not going to do that, you see.
Paul, please,
and yet
be our guest.
And yet I don't precisely know what I'm going to say next. And so this sense of openness, of freedom, does seem to be something to do with an edge of chaos phenomenon. And when you look at the operation of the brain, it does have various instabilities. It is operating on the edge of a number of instabilities, which could be associated with this sense of freedom that we all have. So I think the edge of chaos does apply to the human brain, and probably to artificial intelligence too, if we're to give it the sort of creativity that human beings actually have.
Human creativity and free will. When you feel your own mental processes, such as they are, you have a feeling that chaos theory is applicable there. Einstein talked about the intuitive leap, struggling with a massive notion but being unable to find it. Goes to sleep, wakes up in the morning, it's there. Can this be a part of the chaos within our neurons and synapses?
Oh yes, I think that there's a subconscious level where we can work things out without being aware of them. I am a great fan of doing crosswords, and I'll often get stuck on a clue and will fall asleep, and the next morning instantly it's there. It's as if some part of my brain has been working on it without my knowing about it. Often if I'm stumped with a problem, maybe a mathematical problem, if I just go and do something else for a bit, fiddle around in the garden or something of that sort, I find it very helpful just to get my mind off the immediate problem. And then when I go back to it, again, it's much easier. The answer seems to be there.
But so the process of imagination is a constant process of stirring a bit of chaos up in your own mind, isn't it? And then hoping something will come out of it.
I remember Fred Hoyle once remarking that if he was stuck on a scientific problem, he'd go walking in the hills, would allow his thoughts to be scattered, okay? And then when they fell back together, they may come back in a different arrangement, and the problem would be solved. So I think you're quite right, that this idea of stirring the pot or stirring the ideas is a very good one. And creativity is, after all about doing something new. The essence of chaos theory is that we don't know what is going to come next. The future is unpredictable. We're going to get something which is new, which wasn't foretold. And if we want human creativity, or creativity in nature around us, it's got to have that element of unpredictability. But it mustn't be total anarchy. It's got to be some sort of amalgam of order and chaos. All this discussion of human creativity raises what I think is the biggest of the big questions, which is how human beings can make any sense at all of the world that they live in. Why does the universe have enough order that we can discern an underlying lawfulness, and yet enough chaos to permit things like nature's openness and human free will? The chaos theorist Joseph Ford once remarked to me that he liked to think of God as a sort of riverboat gambler. Well, I think he's quite right, that life, the universe, and everything does have a chaotic element. But I think there's a deeper principle at work as well, a principle which somehow harnesses the openness of chaos and provides a felicitous amalgam of order and chaos that in some sense gives us the best of all possible worlds.
Questions are posed, answers proposed, but for every answer there's a new question. The insatiable nature of human curiosity has given us everything from the wheel to the Hubble telescope. Our need for knowledge does not diminish with discovery, but like the universe itself, continues to expand.